In today's video, we are focusing on one of the best fish in the hobby today, the Oscar. Oscars are amazing South American cichlids that have incredible personality, size, and they have a lot of care requirements that are important to know before you keep them. So we're going to cover everything you need to know when keeping the Oscar fish. So let's dive right in. So first of all, the Oscar is known to be very personable, maybe the most of any cichlid or fish in the aquarium hobby, because they really come up to the front of the glass, get to know their owner, and they even have mood swings. I swear if I move things around the aquarium or do a water change, my Oscar will go in the corner and pout. I sometimes feel like I know what he's thinking, and he's always looking at me with those big eyes. And that's one of the reasons why they're so commonly kept in the hobby today, because people love that about keeping Oscars. And also when you see them in the store, maybe at a PetSmart or a Petco, they're really small with those big eyes, and they're following you around, and then you take them home and don't realize how big these guys actually get. You put them in a 10 or 20 gallon tank, and in about a month you are in trouble. So Oscar fish come from South America in many different areas. In Brazil, Venezuela, Paraguay, there's a lot of regions they come from, and they're also invasive to some areas like Florida or other warm regions where the Oscars can survive that year-round temperature. But again, that points to the main issue in keeping Oscar fish is that most beginners do not realize how big they get, and then they have way too small of an aquarium or they release them in the wild. It is probably one of the most abused fish, unfortunately, in the hobby today, because most people don't have the means to upgrade to a 75 gallon or larger, which we'll talk about in a minute here. Oscar cichlids have a few different color patterns and variations to choose from. I love the Tiger Oscar. This is mine that I've had for over 7 years now and absolutely love them. There's also the red or copper Oscar. There's also lemon Oscars or long-tail varieties. There's also the albino variation of all of these, which I know a lot of people like, myself included. I would definitely like to get an albino soon. But as you can see from this footage, they get absolutely huge, easily reaching over a foot in length, up to about 14, even up to about 16 inches in some cases in a big enough or good enough environment. And on top of that max size, they also grow lightning quick, one of the fastest growing cichlids you will find in the hobby. Here's my Oscar when I got him just over an inch in length, and he grew up to about 5 inches in the first 5 months. And then in the first year, he was probably already at 10 to 11 inches. And this is very common. Oscars are known to grow 8, 9, 10, 11 inches in the first year of keeping them. So obviously if you buy one from a pet store and put it in too small of an aquarium, that's a major issue very quickly. And this also comes into play when picking tank mates, which we'll also talk about here in a minute. As Oscars grow and mature, they can change their color pattern a bit, and when they're in different moods, they will look a little bit different. Here's a post I made on other platforms a while ago when I had my Oscar about 5 years and then the Oscar 5 years later, and most people commenting on that said it was not the same fish, that it turned from a tiger Oscar to a copper Oscar or a red Oscar, but it was the same fish. You can see it documented on the channel. But the point here being is that Oscars can definitely change color patterns as they grow and mature. And so considering that massive size and that growth rate, the biggest topic I think with Oscars is tank size and tank mates. So for tank size, this is a controversial topic for most people. The minimum, bare minimum I would ever say for just a solo adult Oscar would be a 75 gallon tank, but it will definitely feel small, especially if you really come to love your Oscar. That will just not seem like a big enough aquarium for him. Anything smaller than that, like a 55 gallon, absolutely not for a full-grown Oscar, especially if you have any type of tank mates with him. A 55 gallon front to back is only 12 inches, and if an Oscar is 14 inches in length, he literally can't turn around in that. It is too small for an Oscar. So if you're going to get an Oscar or you have one now, definitely try to get the biggest tank possible for them. I would really recommend a 125 gallon or like a 6-foot tank size for an Oscar, and especially if you're going to be putting tank mates with them long term, I would recommend that 6-foot tank or larger. I had my Oscar in a 75 gallon for about 4 months as kind of a grow out, and then he went in a 180 for a long time, and then I built a 500 gallon plywood aquarium mainly for him and a few of the tank mates, but I really just loved him so much I wanted to give him a massive space. And in that 500 gallon tank, he swam all around it, up, down, around, decor. It was just really cool to see how much they explore their environment, and that is why it's really sad to see them kept in such small tanks. when people don't have the education and they buy them at the pet store really small. So hopefully this video is helping you in that regard. Another controversial thing about the Oscar is its aggression level. Some people will say they are the most calm, docile cichlids, where other times people will say they are terrors and they are super aggressive. Most of the time, I would say they are semi-aggressive to not aggressive much at all. And usually when we hear people say their Oscar is very aggressive, we ask for their tank size and setup, and it is too small, and the Oscar is just crammed in with other fish that he shouldn't even be with in the first place. One thing to note is that any tank mate that is small enough to fit in your Oscar's mouth probably will eventually, if it gets bored or gets hungry, the Oscar will probably eat that smaller fish eventually. You could get lucky for a while, but that's usually the case. So considering the tank size requirements and that semi-aggressive nature, what are great tank mates for Oscars? And this can be tricky because you want some fish that are big enough that they won't be eaten, but some of the big cichlids out there, big monster fish, could even bully your Oscars. So it's trying to find that balance when picking tank mates. One of my favorites to keep with the Oscar is the Severum cichlid. It is another South American cichlid that gets good size, it's not too aggressive, and just pairs very, very well with the Oscar. But we're going to continue on with some other South American fish if you want to keep it region specific. I love the chocolate cichlid. It's a great option. It gets just about as big as the Oscar and it's not overly aggressive. I think the true parrot cichlid is a great option, which is an underrated cichlid. I think the green tear or gold som can usually go with an Oscar, especially if they're big enough and they're not too small compared to the Oscar. Electric blue acara are awesome tank mates and they really complement the colors of that Oscar nicely. And geophagus, which sift through the sand, they're earth eaters and there's a lot of varieties of geophagus to pick from. One thing to note though, because species like geophagus, if you are introducing an Oscar, say it's 2 inches long with 2-inch long electric blue acara and a 2-inch long geophagus, that Oscar is going to outgrow them and be very big after the year mark, where the other fish may still only be about 3 inches, maybe 4. And that can lead to issues if your Oscar is then big enough that it will really do damage and maybe eat them. So something I've always said on the channel, if you want your best chance of success, maybe get those smaller to medium-sized cichlids for a while, let them grow up a few inches before adding a smaller Oscar. They will probably not pick on that smaller Oscar, and that Oscar will eventually pass them in size probably within a year anyway, and then you have a really good community of cichlids to go along with your Oscar. We also maintain Billy Donovan's 180-gallon aquarium. He's the head coach of the Chicago Bulls, and we put that Oscar in the 180 when it was smaller than the other fish, and it quickly grew to match their size, and that's kind of what we recommend with a lot of different tank mate options. You could also keep Oscars with other Oscars. I've seen them do really well in small to medium-sized groups. Again, they all get big, so you need a big tank, but you could definitely keep them. Other South American fish, a variety of plecos would be great. If you get the common pleco, make sure you have a massive tank because they get really big. Silver dollars are great. Another really cool option if you have the tank space would be the flagtail, which has incredible coloration on its tail, and it's a pretty docile fish. Also gets very large though. And then maybe the banded leporinas or different types of leporinas from South America. A few types get kind of aggressive, but you could get some that are a little more peaceful. Again, just making sure they're not the small to medium-sized tetras that are going to be too small that the Oscar might pick off. There are some Central American cichlids that I've seen kept with Oscars, some of the Amphilophus species, some of the Parachromis. I think the jaguar is a bit aggressive for the Oscar at times, but could probably work. I think red devils and Midas might be in that same category, a little too aggressive, but can work, especially if you have a big tank. Jack Dempsey's, convicts, fire mouse, absolutely really good tank mates for the Oscars most times. Nicaraguan cichlids are underrated options for the Oscar. I think they go really well. Rainbow cichlids could also be a choice. I think the Starry Night cichlid is an underrated option, which is a beautiful cichlid from Madagascar. And then some Southeast Asian fish like the bala shark has been a great tank mate for my Oscar. Tinfoil barbs are very active, but you need a really big tank. Maybe even the denizen barbs, if you get them big enough, could really work well with an Oscar. Another Southeast Asian option that would be great is the clown loach, because they kind of stay out of the way. They have a lot of interesting personality, color pattern to them, and usually the Oscar won't be picking at them too much. And Oscars can even go with some monster-sized fish like your arowana, pacu. A lot of big catfish could work with them. some gar. So there are a lot of really big tank busters that could also go with Oscars or a big school of Oscars. But then what are some options to probably stay away from? Well, anything that is really small, like any neon tetra or similar sized tetra or barb, even something as big as like a Colombian tetra likely will be picked off by the Oscar. Some of the dwarf cichlids like Apistogramma, golden eye cichlids, checkerboards, Bolivian rams, those might be too small to keep with an Oscar long term. Something really graceful and peaceful like the discus or even the angelfish, they probably won't do very well with an Oscar. The angelfish might, but it's also a pretty different body size and behavior. I've seen it work, but it's just a risk. Some Lake Tanganyikan fish could work, maybe the Frontosa, but some of them that stay smaller, like the Calvus, the Juliidochromis, the shell dwellers, those probably aren't good options. They're probably too small. And then some of your Lake Malawi African cichlids, like your peacocks and haps, maybe the Mbuna, maybe. Some people will throw them in a tank and it works, but sometimes people don't love to mix regions like that, and sometimes the behavior and the aggression levels just don't totally match, and I like to keep my Oscar happy and the other fish not being picked on, so it's just not something I would totally recommend, even though I've seen it work and I've seen people have success. And when it comes to feeding your Oscar, this is really simple in my opinion. Any type of high quality flake or pellet or frozen foods like Brighton shrimp and bloodworms, those would be great options for your Oscar. Once it starts to reach its adult size, you could even chop up pieces of shrimp or other seafood, and he would probably enjoy that as well as kind of a treat. I usually feed just big krill flakes and monster pellets to my Oscar right now. That's the majority of his diet, but I will cut up some of that seafood and throw it in there maybe once every month just to give him a treat. If your Oscar is still small, go for smaller flakes and pellets, and as he grows, grow the size of the pellet and the flake along with it, and he should be just fine. I do recommend against using live feeder fish just because it can introduce disease to the aquarium or to your Oscar, and also your Oscar could swim around hitting decor and injuring itself trying to get that feeder fish, so it's just not something I personally recommend, and my Oscar is totally healthy and he's thrived on dry and frozen foods. And usually when we do a care guide video like this, we talk about water parameters earlier on, but when it comes to the Oscar, they are so adaptable, it really does not matter. You could have hard water or soft water. Their preference would be softer water with lower pH, and that's kind of mimicking their natural habitat, but they're mostly tank bred and they're mostly going to be just fine. They're very, very hardy fish and they're going to work well in any water parameters. I would definitely not try and alter your pH or water parameters to fit anything. I would just keep things consistent. But the main thing with water parameters is just to keep your nitrates low. Because Oscars can eat so much and they get so big, they produce a lot of waste. They produce a lot of ammonia, which converts into a lot of nitrates, and that means you need to remove those nitrates somehow, and live plants or water changes is the way to do that. And because Oscars are going to be really, really tough on live plants, they'll probably destroy any, move them around the tank, and make it really difficult to remove nitrates through plants. You are likely going to be doing a lot of water changes. In tanks with my Oscar, depending on this scenario, I've been doing anywhere from like a 25 to like a 40% water change every 1 to 2 weeks. Again, depending on the level of nitrates, I try to keep those below 40 parts per million. Just get a simple test kit and check your water parameters for that. Like keeping any other fish, you want your ammonia and nitrite to be 0, meaning you have a cycled tank converting them into nitrates so that you can then remove them through water changes or plants if you're that lucky. Another thing to keep in mind with the nitrates is if they build up too long and your water quality is poor, Oscars are known to get hole in the head disease, and that can be really difficult to treat for, so just make sure you're on top of your water changes and keeping those nitrates low, and the Oscars should have no issues because they are so hardy. So when it comes to the tank setup, live plants may not really work out. You could maybe do some fake plants. I've always done fake plants with my Oscars. Eventually they'll pick off some of those leaves and move them around, but I think it looks better than having no greenery in your aquarium. But the things I would usually recommend are big pieces of driftwood, maybe some heavier rocks or some rock piles that won't be easily moved around. The Oscar will absolutely interact with everything in your aquarium, so you just need to make sure it's sturdy and it's not going to be knocked over and hitting the glass. So sand or gravel would definitely work. I always love using sand. Oscars will dig pits in any substrate depending on whatever mood they're in that day, but I really love the sand substrate. Carib Sea Sunset Gold looks super natural to me, and I really like it for South American cichlids like the Oscar. So if I was to recommend an ideal tank setup for the Oscar, it would be a 180-gallon aquarium with brown to tan substrate, big pieces of driftwood, some big rocks, maybe a couple fake plants, and the tank mates, of course, being something like medium to larger size South American cichlids or other South American fish that stay a good size as well. When it comes to equipment on an Oscar tank, the filters are probably the most important. You need some good filtration, obviously, when your Oscar has such a big bioload. Usually canister filters are my go-to. I really like sumps as well. You could get away with sponge filters or even hang on the backs if they're big enough, but I really think the cleanest look is going to be canister filters, the bigger sizes, or a really nice sump. One additional thing I recommend for cichlid tanks, and especially an Oscar tank, would be a wave maker. You can angle it up towards the surface and create surface agitation, which provides a lot of oxygenation in your water, and it'll give some extra flow in your tank to go along with your filtration, which not only improves the filters because it's kicking up debris and then moving them into the intake, but it also removes some of that additional waste that the Oscar might be producing and preventing dead spots of things that are accumulating on your substrate and looking bad. Also, my Oscar just loves to swim in the current, so that's another benefit of having a weight maker. When it comes to the light, the world is kind of your oyster. It doesn't need to be anything expensive unless you have some plants in there that are not being shredded up by your Oscar. You could definitely go with the more high-end light. I really like the AI primes because they give a great shimmer like this on the Oscar, but you could definitely get by with any type of lighting with the Oscar. I would just recommend keeping things a little bit dim and not be super bright, which would stress out almost any cichlid. Also, when it comes to the tank setup, highly recommend firm lids on your tank. Oscars will definitely jump out if you don't have secure lids, and you don't want that to happen, of course, and that can help limit any type of evaporation from your tank. And the last piece of equipment would just be a heater, because they do need to be in tropical temperatures, something over 75 degrees Fahrenheit up to about 81 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit would be ideal for the Oscar. But just have those heaters secure, because like anything in the tank, they will try and move them around. And like I mentioned, my Oscar is about 7 years old, and I hope I have many more years with him. Oscars' lifespans can be very long, up to 15 years or more, so it is a commitment when you buy them, but it is a good commitment because they're a very rewarding fish to keep, super personable. They become a true wet pet in your home, and that's why I think it's one of the best cichlids in the hobby today. As long as you care for it appropriate and get those basic requirements, there should be no issues at all keeping the Oscar. So there it is, everything you need to know when keeping the Oscar cichlid, one of the best fish in the hobby today. If you have any questions or comments, leave that down in the section below. But thanks again for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.